Good afternoon. How exciting to be on a stage here in the floating island to do something that I love very, very much, which is to speak to each of you as the chairwoman of Women in Tobacco. This is a huge honor, and I'm very grateful to have such amazing, tenacious women in front of me who are all formidable and enlightening in their own right. It is also my privilege to welcome a GTNF stalwart, but also a Women in Tobacco representative who's been on our board since the inception. In fact, perhaps after a drink or two, Angela and I might share about the Baker's Dozen dinner that actually helped create Women in Tobacco. But for now, I have the privilege of welcoming Angela Harbut on the stage, who will host today's session and introduce our moderator and panelists. For those of you who would like to learn more about Angela, and more than you'll hear shortly about our moderator and panelists, please take advantage of that program that we prepared for you. So without further ado, Angela Harbut.
Thank you very much, Elise. Very pleased indeed to be here. Now, curiously, we're a little under the clock today, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time right now talking to you guys about WIT or myself or Elise and our role in it. I'm going to head straight on in, introduce our panel, and then allow them, and Valerie in particular, to lead the way. So we have a wonderful moderator, Valerie Solomon, who has the most fantastic title that's ever been given to anybody as Head of Legal Wellness and Stimulation at BAT. I love that one. Marina Murphy, Science Director of Scientific and Medical Affairs at ANS. Elaine Round, Global Head of Toxicology at BAT. Priscilla Samuel, Executive Vice President of Science, Research and Development at Reynolds, America. And Jessica Zdinak, Chief Research Officer of Applied Research and Analysis Company. I'll leave them to it, and Valerie, please take it away. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, Bryce, well, thank you for joining us today. We hope to take questions at the end, but I think our time is a little more contracted than we realized, so let's move right into it. So we'll start with Priscilla. Priscilla Samuel, you and I did not cross paths at Reynolds, but I know sort of the space that you're working in now, and I'm curious, when and how did you choose to become a scientist?
So when I was growing up, I used to volunteer with a not-profit within the family at programs that were focused on children's feeding and women's upliftment, as well as a few other programs like medical outreach. And so which kind of got me into being interested in micronutrient deficiencies. And which you see a fair amount in rural parts of India, which is where I was doing this. And so that got me interested in human nutrition. And so that led me to getting my bachelor's, my master's, and my PhD in human nutrition science. I ended up getting minors in business and in public health as well. And right out of my PhD, I had the privilege to actually work and lead the research for the world's leading micronutrient deficiency, iron deficiency anemia. So it's been quite a journey, but it's been very interesting so far, and I totally enjoy what I'm doing.
Excellent, thank you. Renata, did y'all sort of fall into science? Did you have like a watershed moment in terms of when you decided that was something of interest to you? I know that you're interested in the journalism side, but how did you start your career?
Well, when I was growing up in Ireland, it's not a very original story. I've heard people say the same thing. I really liked Star Trek, you know, like the original Star Trek. And I really liked Captain Kirk. And I really liked teleportation. And I would have really liked some teleportation when I was on that 12-hour flight from London. That would have been really nice. So I loved the idea of teleportation, and I thought, well, you know, the usual saying, if somebody's thought about it, well, somebody's trying to do it and somebody will make it happen. And of course, you had the tricorder, you know, could fix everything. So I was fascinated by just this idea of a world that had science at the base of everything that you do. And the other thing, of course, is growing up in Ireland, like the Republic of Ireland is a very new republic, right? It's only 100 years old. And I was born in the 60s. And when I was a child, education was very important because it was a new republic. And, you know, there's no class system in Ireland like, say, there is in the UK. So education is really important. And one of the things that was focused on a lot was science and maths. So I was kind of in the perfect position in that I was in a country where they were pushing education, third level education, but I also had this interest in it because of Captain Kirk. And went to university and I did a science degree. And then when I finished, I thought, I'm too young to have a real job. I need to stay in university. So I decided to do a PhD. So I did a PhD in chemistry, and the rest is history.
Excellent. How about you, Jessica?
Yeah, so obviously I like to say that science kind of found me as being a scientist, but so, you know, I remember going way back even, you know, 3rd, 4th grade, winning the science fair, setting up an experiment all by myself, and basically took that into, as I got older and realized, for being from a small town, that there wasn't a lot of opportunity. I never knew a scientist. You know, the scientists weren't around where I grew up, but it was very much natural in me to question everything, to wonder why, to wonder how, to make things better through research, through design, through asking the right questions, analyzing data the right way, and I just never really knew that it was even a field. And so my parents, being relatively poor, you know, my dad always just said, you can be anything you want to be. And then there was my mom who said, education is your way out. And so in growing up, I got my bachelor's in psychology, and then went on to get my master's and PhD in experimental psychology and statistics. And really just kind of from there, always took that background of who I am, of questioning things, and took that into the federal government, took that in at Altria, and then now owning my own behavioral science research firm. So science really is at the root of everything I do.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And Elaine, I've known you more than a dozen years. You're one of the first sort of clients I had at Reynolds, and I'm a little ashamed to say that I don't actually know what attracted you to science, but I'm also curious to know, you know, what attracted you to the industry. So if you could sort of elaborate on that, I'd love to hear it.
Sure. So the science piece, anyway, was when I was a kid, I was always interested in biology and human biology in particular, and I was, I guess all kids kind of ask why a lot, but I liked that word. So I studied biology when I was in graduate school, and I always thought, or in college, and I always thought I wanted to go to medical school, actually. But my first job was in a lab, and I worked in a fruit fly lab, so a Drosophila lab. And the job was awful, actually. So, well, it was good, and that was a job. But it was also awful in that it was my job to clean all of the used fly bottles, like all of the used fly strains. So I'd have to shove them all in the autoclave. It was hot, humid. It stunk. It was awful. But I was also tenacious about this. So I would still show up to work however often. And eventually, because I showed up, they put me in the lab. And so that was like, oh, wow. I was like isolating DNA. That was super cool. But the best thing about it was that my advisor at the time, he just sat at his microscope with all these different fly strains. He would cross them together. And then all of a sudden, you know, a few weeks later, he would see the answer to some biological question that he had. And I thought that was super cool, and I wanted to do that. So I went to graduate school in genetics because of that, actually. So I guess long story short, getting to industry. So I didn't do a postdoc after graduate school. I kind of wanted to do something a little more applied. I did some science education outreach. I worked for and thought genetic counseling would be interesting. Didn't have counseling experience, worked for a nonprofit in the US that was about female healthcare, very much about female healthcare. Loved being there. Quit my job. Took an entry-level position. My parents thought I was crazy. What are you doing? You've been in school for how long? But I loved it. Anyway, one of the providers there got me into clinical research, and so I collected a lot of data when it was basically on the ground in physicians' offices conducting phase 3 trials. Collected a lot of data, saw no results, and thought, oh my gosh, this is super frustrating, and I really am a scientist after all. And then I was in North Carolina at that time, and there was a job at Reynolds that had kind of the clinical piece and the science piece, actually. I get to write protocols and execute studies, and then see the results and do it all over again. And the thing that got me there, actually, was I thought I would never work for a tobacco company, but it was, even in 2008, when I joined Reynolds, the job description was all about harm reduction and how to reduce the health impact of tobacco products. And I was like, oh, that's super cool. I want to do that. So that's how I got into industry.
Excellent. And Priscilla, I think we had talked about, I think you didn't have the Drosophila experience, but you did have a very different micronutrient, nutrition, human science. What brought you to the industry? What attracted you to it?
Yeah, so I was traveling out of the country, and I got contacted by this recruiter about a job that looked pretty interesting. And so when I got back in, I talked with her out of pure curiosity, really, first. And then when she told me it was a job with the tobacco industry, I was a little skeptical because for all of my career, I had been leading and working on products that were the leaders in their space as it relates to food, supplements, ingredients, and pretty much, very much science-driven, science-based products. And so not knowing much about the tobacco world, I was initially skeptical and asked a lot of questions. So, needless to say, I went through the interview process and had a ton of questions as it relates to the science and the investment. And when I heard about what BAT wanted to do as it relates to transformation and in the future and where it wanted to go, I was even more skeptical because I realized this is going to take quite a bit of money. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of investment to be, where we want to be in terms of transformation, in terms of tobacco harm reduction, in terms of health claims, And so before my second round of interviews, I did a ton of digging and a ton of reading with regards to publications, the research, the publications that the tobacco industry was involved in, the company was involved in. And I, to be honest with you, was quite fascinated and was pleasantly surprised. And I was assured of the investment in the science. I, decided to take the leap of faith as well as the challenge and joined the company as the head of regulatory and scientific affairs for the US, and then kind of moved into this role a few months later. But it's really been quite fascinating, and I've been quite amazed, to be honest with you, with the amount of investment that the tobacco world, as well as the company, i.e. BAT Reynolds, invests in science. And I have really been pleased to see the quality of the science, i.e. the high quality of the science, as well as the caliber of scientists that we have on board. And so that's really been exciting. That's really been, good for the one who started out a little bit skeptical. I certainly was, converted. But I think we have a lot and ways to go, many challenges, obviously. But that's kind of how I got to where I am with regards to being here today.
Excellent. Thank you. And I think, when I came to Reynolds, there was a lot of great science being done already, even prior to the PMTA process, right? But I think a lot of that has been driven by the need to have sort of dossiers for products individually. And I suspect that a lot of the work that you do specifically has to do with supporting product applications. But I think you were in pharma before you came to the industry and then to start your own company.
Yeah, so I was at National Institutes of Health, so public health, and reviewed as a social scientist there, reviewed applications across the 27 office and different directorships there at the NIH, did a lot of collaboration with CDC, FDA, CTP, and so I was overseeing that work and providing guidance on their science. And yeah, what's really interesting to me in transitioning from the more public health scenario to industry, specifically at Altria, I think both of you guys were saying, which is the caliber of science is unbelievable. And I was completely shocked when I joined, Altria specifically, to see the level of scientific rigor and some of the smartest individuals I had ever met. In growing and being a woman then, I wanted to chart my own territory and make my own decisions, and that's what led to then combining this public health science, which is very more basic, with the industry science, which is more applied in my own company. So yeah, still conducting the application science.
Excellent. And now Marina and I did a panel at GTNF 8 years ago, and I don't actually know what she did before she came to BAT. I know you were a science journalist, but
Yeah.
what made you decide to come to BAT?
Well, I didn't exactly decide to go to BAT. I mean, it wasn't like my girlhood dream to work for Big Tobacco. And when I finished my PhD, I decided that's great. I really enjoyed my time in university, but I do not want to work in a lab. It's like, I don't want to be stuck in a lab all the time. But I love science, and I want to do something that's related to science, and I want to use all this science education that I have. So I became a science journalist. So I was a science journalist for about 8 years, and it was great because every day was different, and I worked for lots of different places like the BBC and New Scientist and the Irish Times, and so lots of different kinds of science and lots of opportunities and lots of access to people, because people, they like to speak to journalists. They want people to know who they are and know their story, and being a science journalist was great fun, but the only thing is you get paid nothing. Like, journalists don't get paid well at all. And when I had my son, I thought, I need a new job. This is great fun, but I'm not making enough money. I need a new job. So I started looking for a new job, and I found this ad, and it was an ad for a science communications manager. And then I saw up in the corner it said British American Tobacco. I'd never heard of British American Tobacco, because I think, like most people, we know what the brands are, right? We're familiar with brands. We've seen people smoking Benson and Hedges, or we've seen Lucky Strike or whatever. But anyway, in my case, I'd never heard of British American Tobacco. And I immediately thought, I've been a journalist for 8 years or 10 years or whatever it is. And I was like, how do I not know that tobacco companies do science? I was like, how do I not know this? So, and I thought, is it me or is it them or what is it? So I was very interested just to talk to them about what could they possibly be doing? What could you possibly be doing? Because I think when you have no information or knowledge, it's hard to imagine. But then when you see all the different things that are being done, it's actually really interesting. And at the time when I was a science journalist, it was like the best time to be a science journalist, because that's when they sequenced the human genome. That's when stem cell research became a thing. They started cloning. So there was lots of really exciting stuff happening in science. So I really wanted to talk to these guys. So I went and talked to BAT, and I liked what they had to say, because again, they had just sort of instigated their tobacco harm reduction program. So they had a big program, and they had made a big decision to move away from traditional tobacco products into newer products. And they also had made a decision that they wanted to climb out of this hole that, maybe they didn't put themselves in the hole, but they didn't help, because tobacco companies were so quiet, right? They didn't talk to people, they didn't engage, they didn't talk about their science. So they wanted to create a function to enable them to do that. And I thought that was very interesting. And I also like to think that I'm a broad-minded person. I think to be a scientist, you have to be a broad-minded person. So to me, the fact that it was a tobacco company was not a problem, because, I'm not in the business of telling people what to do. It's a legal product. People use it, so why not have the best products that you can possibly have? So I took the job.
Excellent. Sound like applause from the audience on that line. No, several of you touched on the fact that, there are various challenges. You weren't aware that tobacco folks were doing science. It all just sort of came new to me as well. I think ultimately one of the biggest challenges we have as an industry is that we're still sort of fighting to get out of that hole where people don't know that the science is being done, where people don't know the good work that's being done. Or when we, publicize it, it might seem like sort of self-serving, as opposed to sort of building a body of evidence around what we're doing. And I think one of the things we talked about way back at that panel was sort of the failure of science journalism to get it right.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's because they're low paid and so therefore they're not focusing on the issues, or they just don't understand them, and so it's easier to have a soundbite. I mean, I'd like to hear what you think about whether we've made any advances in those 8 years, but I'd also love to hear from the rest of you about what do you think the biggest challenges are with respect to what the industry's facing right now from a scientific standpoint.
Well, I can talk about the comms issue. I think scientific communications or science press is very different to, we'll say, any other beat that you may be working. Like, say if you're a political journalist and you find out that the PM is going to resign tomorrow, you know, you don't get told, oh, PS, by the way, you can't say anything until tomorrow. You just straight away, I'm breaking the story. Whereas with science journalism and science news, it's very controlled by the publication houses. So if you look at Nature Publishing Group, they have a huge press office and they have huge numbers of journals. And they control how this information is released. So this information is released in advance, but it's under embargo. So the science journalists are very controlled and they all do everything at the same time. So that's why you see Tuesday you wake up and if there's a big science story, everybody has the same story, because the publishing houses are controlling how that information is released and when and how you can talk about it and who you can talk to about it. So it's very different. And because journalists are under such pressure to not miss anything, they're not going to say not do the big story in Nature because, you know, you, Valerie, have a good story from BAT, because they're like, I'll get into trouble with my editor if I haven't covered this and everybody else has. So I think it's very difficult, and if you do manage to get a good news story out, as you know, as a comms person who works for nicotine or tobacco, I think you're doing a fantastic job, because you're competing with this whole system of the scientific publishing houses, and they own the science newswires as well. So, like, say, Science Magazine is owned by the AAAS. They also own Eureka Alert, and that's the science newswire. So, you know, there's a lot of control around how science data is released and how it's released into the media specifically.
It's big science data. Priscilla, I mean, you're less than a year in the industry. Do you perceive these challenges the same way? I mean, what do you think is the biggest challenge facing us currently?
Yeah. So I knew I'd be a little sleep deprived, so I got myself a few notes here in terms of what those challenges are. So I think we do have several challenges. I think one of the big challenges is really the the balance of focus between youth access and tobacco harm reduction. In terms of the research, in terms of the policies, regulatory, everything. I think while there's a fair amount of focus on the youth access from a regulatory perspective, I don't believe there's sufficient focus on the tobacco harm reduction. So in terms of what got me here, I mean, all of the exciting research that BAT was doing, everything from vaccines to tobacco harm reduction to health claims to worth, all of these research, we have a long ways to go still, and in that balance. And there needs to be a lot more focus on the tobacco harm reduction, because there needs to be, the freedom to be able to provide the products, i.e. science-driven products that are innovative and available to consumers who choose to continue to smoke, but with less harmful products, So I think that opportunity is stifled to some degree because of the long regulatory timelines that it takes to get products cleared. And to me, as I come into this industry, I'm rather baffled and concerned because those timelines are somewhat unique to the tobacco world. And it isn't just a US phenomenon in terms of this balance that we need and in terms of the better balance and better focus. And so, because we've got millions of smokers around the world that could benefit from less harmful products. At the same time, I think we as an industry, as regulatory bodies, and as say media, etc., all of us really need to come together to have the dialogue in terms of what it's going to take to move things forward, i.e. the scientific community, the regulatory community, the industry, media, etc. We really need to come together to find a solution to move things forward and together, all on the same page. And that really needs to happen a lot more going forward. And lastly, it's a little similar to what you were talking about, which is the whole education piece. I think there's really a desperate need for education. There's so much of misperceptions and misunderstanding around the science. And until and unless the gatekeepers of information are better educated about the science and about the issues, the information won't get to those who need it most and those who need to make those switches. And so it's really, really important for us to come together also on the communications and education front, be it the scientific community, the healthcare professional community, us as an industry, as well as the media. All have a role to play in getting the information and the science to those who need to hear it. Both the gatekeepers as well as the end users really need to. If not, we're going to be here 25 years from now, still with the same issues. So it's a now issue, not an issue that, needs to be addressed 10 years from now. It really is now.
Agreed. I mean, in a couple of weeks, you're going to be the global head of life sciences for BAT. I mean, are you excited to be able to have more of a hand in how that is not only done within the building, but sort of conveyed externally, to the extent that you are? I mean, I'm not making up your job title for you.
No, that's great, thanks. I am. I think there's a huge opportunity there. I know we do a lot of kind of science communication, communicating the great science that we do. So yeah, I think there's huge opportunity. I think that, and maybe just to build on what Priscilla had said as well, was kind of education around nicotine itself. And there's huge misperceptions on the harms of, or lack thereof, of nicotine. So I think that's a really important issue. And in addition, kind of continuing to build the credibility of the industry and inclusion of the industry. I know there are certain, obviously some very large conferences and venues where the industry, even though we do such rigorous science, I know kind of we've all worked within the industry and kind of really understand kind of the top-notch scientists, the rigorous science that we do, really to kind of uphold those principles, continuing to work to kind of continue to establish our credibility among public health as well.
And I think a rising tide raises all ships. Obviously, we're not going to collaborate on everything as an industry, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to have that sort of synergy between different groups and companies, because obviously it's going to help all of us, right? If there are fewer nicotine misperceptions, if there's more sharing of data, if there's more of an acceptance publicly, globally, of the actual reality of that data. I mean, I don't know how much you get to explore that in your space, but.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's one of those things where is there opportunity not just to come together in the large industry, but even bringing in, the medium size, the small guys, even though there's less and less of the small guys, due to regulatory burden, but, also folks who are in the middle, like us on our team. Like, we don't play either side, whether it's public health or industry. We're supporting both because we support science, right? We support data, evidence-based decision-making, evidence-based policy. And so I think there's opportunity, because when I talk to my colleagues who received a PhD with me, some are in tobacco control. Actually, one of them just received the $3 million grant to study the effect of flavors at Ohio State. And I talked with him, and they have conversations with the FDA when they design their research. They work with them very much, I think, like the pharmaceutical industry. And there's a rapid response from the FDA and the regulator. If maybe industry isn't the one that's going to be able to develop that relationship with our regulator, specifically in the United States, but maybe folks that are on the outside can start to develop that. Because how can we make sure we're delivering what the FDA is looking for and asking for if we can't have a conversation with the FDA? And I say we as like I'm one of you all, which I'm not. But at the same time, I believe it's imperative that your work is taken to the FDA and having conversations with them to give us feedback.
Absolutely. I think I was a food and drug lawyer in private practice for a dozen years, or 10 years before I came to Reynolds, and I think it was so shocking to me when the Center for Tobacco Products first got off the ground, because I was used to dealing with CIFSAN in the food and supplement space, where I literally had a person's name that I could call, and they couldn't always tell me what I wanted to know, but they would at least answer that call. And it was, guidance was given sort of on an ad hoc basis, and it was, I felt almost like I had misrepresented myself coming to Reynolds as an FDA expert when there's nothing, no one's an expert in CTP, because they're not always willing to sort of make those connections.
Right.
But just weighing in on that. So shifting gears somewhat, I think we're getting low on time, and I want to make sure there's an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. But I think you and I had spoken, I think yesterday, about the fact that you have a 9-year-old daughter. And so what advice would you give to a young person, or even someone starting out in college or in their career, in terms of getting into science, or the industry even for that matter?
Gosh, that's a great question. So my entire career, I've struggled as a woman, as a blonde woman. I don't know what it is, but I have always struggled and faced stereotypes, stigma. I even remember I was a professor for statistics at a university way back when, before the 3 kids aged me, so I guess I probably did look a little bit young. But I heard so many comments, who is she? What does she know? And it took me weeks and weeks to build rapport with my students, to know, for them to realize that I did know what I was talking about. I sucked it up, and I continue to suck it up. I just get it done, right? And so I just prove people wrong when they say you can't do it. My motto is go do it. So my daughter, she's 9, and she is the quarterback for her football team. And she is 2 of 9 people in 3rd grade who are in the advanced math. Two of 9, 2 of them are girls, the rest are boys, out of her class of 45. And she comes home almost every day, and says, I threw an interception and the boys tease me. But more so it's, why are the boys making fun of me in our advanced math group? So she's going in that STEM direction, right? And she asks those why questions, but I see even her struggle. And so I tell her every single day, which is, 1, you're there for a reason, right? They picked you for a reason. You occupy that seat, and you make sure that they know that you deserve to be at that seat. And I say to her, hey, you might not know that. Well, let's go learn it, right? Let's go get it done. And then I also tell her, and kind of would tell young career women the same thing, which is be unapologetically you. Know that you can occupy that seat, and you're going to have struggles. I think we all have struggles, right? And we all face certain stereotypes or biases. And being in a male-dominated field for a while, I think it was very difficult to hear my voice see my voice get heard. And one of the most frustrating things, I don't know if you guys ever witnessed it, but is saying something, and 2 minutes later having a man say it, and it's now the best idea. And so
That's never happened to me.
Oh my gosh. And so the other thing I would say is, if you make it to where you're going and you want to go, turn around and help every single person, not just woman, but person, but particularly then women, come up with you. And let's be our very best advocates.
Awesome. People are very inspired by that. Marina, you are a unique human being too. I mean, do you help? You are. I love that about you. Do you find you have an opportunity to mentor women in terms of getting them into science, or has anyone reached out to you about your experience?
Yeah, especially when I was working in the bigger companies, some of the younger women would talk to me, because I guess I'm not the most conservative person in the world, but I still managed to get on in what I would say very conservative companies. And I think sometimes one of the issues is, of course, they are conservative companies, they're old and they're male-dominated, so there is a sort of a male way of managing things that's sometimes different to the female way of managing things. And I think that's one of the things sometimes that's difficult in a big company, is being seen to be a good manager, although you may have a different management style.
Right.
And maybe a style that people aren't necessarily used to, because they're more used to the male way of doing things. And I think that's probably something that a lot of women encounter in their daily job.
Yeah, I know. For Elaine, for example, I think you've been a great manager and leader within the company, and your recent promotion was one of the happiest moments I've had in my dozen years at the companies. But I think, what obstacles have you faced? I think ultimately you've had either some good mentors or at least given some runway that you can sort of overcome some of those obstacles, but surely you've encountered those not only in science, but within a male-dominant industry as well.
Yeah, I think for me, you come in, and I don't know if this is female, this is scientist, but the kind of head down, get your work done, do it well, and your work will speak for you. That was kind of my mentality going in, and that isn't really always how it works. So it kind of that need to kind of make sure you're talking with people, and but it also builds collaboration, right? Kind of the heads down, get it done. It's not always kind of the best way of collaborating. So I think just building relationships, I think was a big one for me. How to get over some of those obstacles, just getting out of my shell in general.
I can relate to
and
that.
then I guess what was the second part of your question?
Just what obstacles you faced in terms of being in a male-dominated industry.
I think
Not
also
to belabor the point.
I think within the science, the strictly scientific arena, actually, I felt like there were fewer obstacles, especially at Reynolds anyway. I felt like that was very welcoming of women to be part of the scientific conversation there, although I won't say I didn't have the same conversations of say something and then somebody else says it a minute later. But it's actually kind of the broader business piece that I think was maybe even a little bit more challenging. Kind of, okay, how do I work in this kind of the broader business aspect, and kind of learning how to operate there. So having other mentors, both male and female, actually, were super helpful, and advocates in that sense.
That's a good point. And Priscilla, you're fairly new to the industry, but I don't know if your previous industry was, well, most American business is male-dominated, let's be honest. But I think ultimately, I don't know, if you're in a fairly high position within Reynolds, so maybe you get more done from a political standpoint, but what obstacles have you faced, either just in the past year or certainly in your previous life, if you will?
Yeah, so the field I picked in terms of science, i.e. human nutrition, is interestingly actually dominated by women.
Excellent.
However, I think when I was the only one in my graduating class that went into the industry. And back then, which was several years ago, when I joined the industry, I realized it got a bit of a rude awakening in that it's dominated by men. It just seemed like every major project, every department, every leader, every innovation was led by men. And I still also remember a time when, in my career, where I had the expertise, the experience, and everything to lead a certain part of innovation at a certain organization. And everyone thought I was going to get it, including the guy who was picked to do it. And I realized that everyone in that decision-making chain, all the way up to the CEO, was a male. And while I was somewhat perplexed and somewhat defeated, I didn't really let that stop me, obviously. I continued, to steer my path as it relates to science and leadership. Took every opportunity to reiterate what I had to offer, and certainly, took on leadership roles, certainly, in the science and innovation and in leadership in various different aspects through the rest of my career. That's got me to where I am. But, so it's not an easy path. And for me, initially, not only just being a woman, but in my case, I was also an international. And so I had the added, edge that I sort of needed, in getting into the industry, et cetera. In fact, it's one of the reasons why when I was doing my PhD, I knew I wanted to go into the corporate world. And so I decided to get a minor in business and marketing. And back then, the business minor was not an approved minor for a PhD science student. So I ended up having to do an approved minor, which was by public health, as well as the unapproved minor, which was the business and marketing, in order to get that and keep that, because I was kind of pretty much headstrong about I do want to do that. And the business school actually welcomed it. I was the first graduate science student at the PhD level to do a minor, and they completely welcomed it. And was sorely disappointed when I decided to join corporate. They actually wanted me to stay in academia. But, I think there are obstacles, there are challenges, but I would encourage every, woman that's looking at industry to not let the male-dominated corporate world, which to some degree it still is today, regardless of which industry you're in, let that deter what you have to offer as an individual, as a woman, as a leader, because there is so much to do, and I think we could use a lot more women leaders in the corporate world.
Absolutely. Completely agree. So we have a little bit of time left. I don't know if anybody has any burning questions they want to ask, or I can continue to poke them about where we're going to be in 5 to 10 years if people actually pay attention to this. So any questions? All right. Well, I'll ask. Oh, go ahead. Sure. Oh, my challenges were. Well, when I went to Reynolds, actually, my clients were mostly scientists, and Elaine's absolutely right. Like, they're much more sort of open to the idea of men and women being equal, or at least allowed in the same conversations. I'm a lawyer, so, and I don't know if anyone here knows Mitch Newhouser, but if it tells you anything, he was the best boss I had in my career at that point, and it was a joke between us because he knew he wasn't a great boss. So I think ultimately, the biggest challenge was not being heard. I think, stating either being afraid to speak out because you'd be looked down on by someone who's dominating conversation, or having what you have to say repeated in the room and everyone agreeing. What a great insight that was, and it's infuriating. And maybe I have a little rage bottled up, but there could have been a moment when I basically just stood up from the table and said, I just said that, and it's not helpful to build resentment, for that matter, to have people not hear their voices heard, but also in a company where you're not listening to the different voices, whether it's someone from a different country or someone from a different industry, or even, so going to Reynolds was interesting to me because it was dominated by men in the law department, obviously dominated by men in the sort of business units, but I think I worked with some amazing women in the science group, and so I really enjoyed having them as clients, and I definitely missed that aspect of my job because I'm back, at the center now, which is more male-dominated, but ultimately I think there's a lot of progress being made in terms of recognizing that they can't all be the way that it used to be, and that certainly there are more voices to be heard in the room. All right, we good? Any final closing words you want to say? We can push it to the limit. All right.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, can you please put your hands together and just thank this panel for such an illuminating and inspiring conversation.